Hi everyone, I'm Justin, and we're talking about empire, its role in the foundation of the discipline of geography, modern versions of imperialism, and a potential future direction for the discipline as a whole. So let's get into it! We start in the 19th century with the Concert of Europe. Unfortunately, this had nothing to do with the Eurovision Song Competition. It was a sort of informal peace agreement amongst the imperial powers of Europe. All these big powers decided, hey, let's not fight here in Europe, let's fight over colonies abroad. And that informal peace worked for a bit, but when Prussia defeats Austria-Hungary and France and forms this new unified state called Germany, the balance of power in Europe changes. Oh, 19th and 20th century Germany, why you always stirring the pot? I'll tell you why! This new German state immediately becomes a major land power in Central Europe, but they came on the scene too late to get in on the good colonizing action. Enter Friedrich Ratzel. Ratzel fought in the war for German unification, but then he comes home and in 1897 he writes a book called Political Geography. Ratzel's looking around Europe, and he sees all these imperial powers with their colonies surrounding Germany, and he thinks, where are we supposed to go? Remember, this is a few decades after Darwin publishes The Origin of Species and just blows everyone's minds. Ratzel was a big fan of this new theory of evolution, and he takes the concept out of a biological context and applies it to social and political questions. Because when has that ever gone badly, right? Ratzel takes evolution and relates it to politics in what he calls his organic state theory. Each state, he argues, is like a species, and all the states struggle for survival, trying to carve out some territory to live in. As populations increase, the state needs more space. In German, that live-in space is called Lebensraum. Everything sounds cooler in German, and more ominous. For Ratzel, a state is always competing with his neighbors, and if you ain't growing, then you're shrinking, and Germany had nowhere to grow. So, the two world wars that follow can be viewed as Germany trying to flip the balance of power in Europe to one where they aren't on the bottom, surrounded by big empires. The take-home from these imperial struggles in the 19th and 20th century is that creating and managing an empire is all about territory at this point. Next foundational text we're talking about in the discipline of geography is Alfred Thayer Mahan's work, The Influence of Sea Power on History, 1660 to 1783, which was published in 1890. Whew! Lot of dates! Mahan was the head of the U.S. Naval War College, so surprise, surprise, he argues that if a country wants to be powerful, they need a strong navy. Controlling the seas means controlling trade. It means being able to put your troops wherever you want, maybe in some shiny new colonies. An important thing to note here is that Mahan's theory about naval power was geographic in a literal sense. A nation was a sea power if it had coasts and if those coasts had harbors. In addition, the type of climate a nation has is important, as is the soil.
So if you're England and you live on an inhospitable rock in the middle of the Atlantic where it's rainy and crappy and nothing grows that tastes good, you might want to start building some boats.
Those boats are initially used for trade, but if you put some guns on them, then you can start bullying the continental empires like France and Holland. So that's Mahan and the beginnings of the idea that geography determines national identity. The next text I'll mention is Sir Halford Mackinder's The Geographical Pivot of History. As you may have guessed from the Sir part, Mackinder was English and he was trying to use the discipline of geography to empower the British Empire. As you may have guessed from the geographical part, Mackinder takes Mahan's idea about sea power and how it comes from the physical aspects of a nation and he applies it to the whole world. Mackinder's trying to create a formula of geographical causation in world history. But he says naval power is like so 18th century. Sure, ships allowed European nations to create empires and dominate Asia, but then railroads came along and changed the game. Suddenly, land power is strong again. Railroads let you move troops around and resupply them easily. And while land power can attack outwards to the coast, naval power can't really do that much about the heartland.
You ever try sailing to Moscow? You can't do it.
So Mackinder thought that there's this pivot area in the heartland of Asia, and then there's this surrounding periphery that's never going to be able to invade the heartland. Both Mahan and Mackinder were trying to use geography to benefit their empires. They both thought military and economic strength came from the specific physical qualities of a nation, and they both had no idea what an airplane was. During the 20th and 21st century in the discipline of geography, we see an interesting rise and fall of the popularity of this notion of environmental determinism. Its opponents say it ignores human agency, economics, capitalism, colonialism. Some support for the theory remained, but for the most part, critical geographers found environmental determinism kinda cringy, especially when used in defense of imperialism. At the end of the 20th century, the US has won the Cold War, capitalism spreading around the world, so where does that leave our notion of empire? In the year 2000, literary theorist Michael Hart and philosopher Antonio Negri released a book called Empire where they lay out their view for a new form of imperialism. For Hart and Negri, this new empire is less of one nation and more of a bunch of interlocking economic structures. The role of states starting to get smaller and smaller, and trans and supranational actors are starting to get more powerful. I'm talking about the UN and the EU, but I'm also looking at you corporations. The world is one big market with nations and supranational actors all working under the logic of globalized capitalism. This is a new form of sovereignty, a new kind of empire. This empire doesn't have a center and it doesn't have permanent territory. It draws strength and legitimacy from the US, but ultimately it doesn't have just one home. This new empire is fluid. It can dematerialize and then rematerialize when it needs to, say, go to war in the Middle East. So there's no longer this duality of a center and a periphery, like Germany can't be on the outside looking in because there is no outside or inside. Empire is no longer about the differences between states and them fighting over territory. So instead of a bunch of competing empires, we're left with one hegemon. And then each state acts as a sort of police force, ensuring that everyone follows the rules of this new neoliberal order. There's plenty of people that disagree with this new idea of empire. They say Hart and Negri don't describe the mechanism of governance. They're too focused on Europe, that they don't focus enough on social and cultural movements. Feminist geographers say, oh shocking, you think powerful men are the most important force on Earth. These criticisms are valid, and we'll come back to them, but I think it's useful to consider Hart and Negri's new notion of an empire without territory or a center organized by the logic of capitalism. You can't talk about modern notions of imperialism and geography without talking about David Harvey, the daddy of new imperialism, as no one calls him. Harvey comes up with this concept of historical geographic materialism, which takes Karl Marx's ideas about how capital functions over time and puts them in a global and spatial context. He was doing this for decades, but he became fixated on why the US decided to invade Iraq in 2003. Surprise, surprise, it's all about oil. Harvey claims that whoever controls the Middle East controls the oil, and whoever controls the oil controls the global economy. You can see how this is a throwback to Mackinder and his idea of the geographic pivot. In addition to the oil, by controlling Iraq, the US gets a geopolitical foothold in Eurasia, which lets them keep an eye on Russia, Iran, and China. So the US controls the globe both economically and militarily. Obviously, there's some similarities between Harvey and Hart and Negri's notions of new imperialism. Harvey agreed that at the end of the 20th century, we saw the emergence of a new capitalist imperial hegemony, which spread through globalization and operated through financial markets. But for Harvey, the state is still central to the neoliberal order because it creates the conditions for capital to accumulate and then it maintains those conditions. But again, this is different from the traditional notion of empires controlling territory. Now, the capitalist empire only needs to open a territory up to flows of capital, and that doesn't even require long-term occupation or political control. Let's revisit some of the valid criticisms of this view of neoliberal imperialism. Some argue that this top-down model of control ignores all of the socio-cultural processes which go into governance, policy, and regulation. The world isn't just a two-dimensional struggle between the oppressors and the oppressed. There's this whole social world outside of that, and the social affects the political. Another interesting critique is that by focusing on oil, this line of geographic thinking is guilty of a form of terrocentrism, a focus on the land rather than an understanding of ourselves as part of a biosphere. So we need a new form of geopolitical thought that merges together human and physical geography but abandons the imperial ethnocentric spatial framings of the past. We need to focus on connections and flows of materials, wealth, and people instead of narrowly looking at the geographic governance of a state. Harvey, Hart, and Negri are concerned with flows too, but mainly the flow of capital and various ways the neoliberal order maintains that flow. The politics of everyday life aren't just determined by these overarching structures of political economy and geography. They're the result of a complex web of interaction between people, places, things, thoughts, capital, oil, everything. So what the field of geography really needs is a post-human view of geopolitics, which considers human and environmental elements without falling into the trap of deterministic thinking. Such a theory can consider top-down economic structure and bottom-up processes of political creation seen in everyday life. It realizes that what's important is the relationship between all these different elements and the political consequences of those relationships. So that's how notions of territorial imperialism and geographic determinism were foundational in discipline of geography, how empire has changed since the 1970s, and what geopolitical thought might look like going forward.